Well, welcome to session 4. This is really accountability framework, and what I want to leave this session with is a roadmap, some ideas about the directions we're going and how we're going to get there. And I look forward to input from all of you in how we might get there. We're going to start, as I said, with a couple of presentations, and then we're going to move into a fireside chat mode. So we're going to approach it that way. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, Saut, Sawasan, Staminas, and Hilkaminum peoples, a land which is currently also named Salt Spring, and which I have the great privilege of living on. It's a beautiful place. Been here for about 15 years. I just want to touch base again with the goals of the symposium just for a moment. I know we've been over this a couple of times, but there may be people here who haven't seen these before. We're all about building co-creative relationships in order to further collaboration. So I want you to think about that as we have our discussions. We're all about enhancing the resiliency of rural communities to respond to climate change and ecosystem disruption. And that's an overarching goal. And the ways that we think we might be able to do that are through new information, new data. I mean, there's lots of data out there, but it isn't necessarily purposed well. So we need access, we need thoughtful data that will inform how communities can enhance their resiliency. And that data can lead us to research questions and, ideas about, I wonder if that's true. Policy initiatives are fundamentally important. And we've had a couple of really good inputs into, over the course of the previous session, several inputs into policy ideas, and then change strategies. And then we want to make sure we have an idea about how we're going to empower and distribute the outcomes of this symposium. And this really articulates more or less what I've just told. I'm not going to go over that again. And I'm going to flip over to Arlen, and you have a couple of modifications, Arlen, for this particular session that I want you to touch on.
Thanks, Stefan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arlen. I'm the network coordinator of RHSRNbc. I've gone over these for the last 3 sessions, so I'm sure everyone's familiar, but for anyone joining in for the first time, we have asked participants to submit questions on slido.com on our event page. You can use the code 4052 to get to our event page and submit questions there. Alternatively, we are also opening up the chat completely to the audience for this session. So if you'd rather submit questions here, I can monitor that as well. Next slide, please. Thanks, Stefan.
That's great. I'm the slide changer now. I got to remember that. Okay.
Thank you. You can also set your screen to speaker view or gallery view based on your preferences. When a speaker is sharing their screen or speaking at that point, you can just use the speaker view, or if you'd like to see everyone on your screen at once, we recommend the gallery view. As participants, you may not be able to mute your mic at this point. This is to avoid any interruptions during the panelists' presentations or as they speak. But when we move on to the Q&A period, then we will remove that function and you will be able to unmute yourself. If you have any technical difficulties with Zoom, audio or video, please contact UBC's MidID service desk at this number shown on your screen. We'll also submit this info in the chat box so you're able to see it. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so we've had registrants from over 45 different communities across BC and Canada, and a few internationally joined the symposium. And the demographic breakdown is shown to your right, although it's mostly academic, but for a percentage. We have seen some representation from health professionals, health administrators, communities, linked sectors, and policymakers as well. And you'll see these diverse categories represented in our panel today. Thanks, Stefan. On to you.
Thank you very much, Arlen. Great. So these are our panelists for our 4th panel, and we're going to switch up the format a little bit. by starting off with a couple of presentations, as I said, and then we're going to move into a fireside chat mode. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Tim Takaro, who's going to start us off. And Tim, you probably have heard of. I certainly have heard lots about Tim. And Tim, rather than me trying to introduce you, can you introduce yourself a little bit? Please tell the participants a little bit of your background and then a bit about what you'd like them to know about you. Over to you, Tim. I'll stop sharing it.
Thanks so much, Stefan. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yeah, I'm a physician scientist. I do occupational environmental medicine, or at least I did until January when I retired from clinical practice. I do research in the health effects of climate change. And more recently, I've been involved in some nonviolent civil disobedience. And so I'm going to speak for the next 10 minutes or so about the advocacy and change aspect of the rural health agenda. And I'm going to use an example from my own experience in civil disobedience. So how did I get to the end of my rope is the title of this, and you'll see why in a bit here. If I can make my slides move, that is. I'm hoping that you do see the Larsen ice sheet breaking off of Antarctica here. Great.
Yes, we do. Perfect.
So this is not that close to us, but it's obviously a major event. This is my university on top of Burnaby Mountain, and you can see it's quite a beautiful spot, and sitting right on the Burrard Inlet, which happens to be the terminus of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, as well as the Trans Mountain pipeline, which is a threat to my university, largely from the fire hazard. You notice we were surrounded by forests, and ironically, as climate change increases the temperatures and reduces humidity in the dry season, this forest is a tinderbox for 6 to 8 weeks out of the year, and that period is extending. And it is extremely dangerous because of the tank farm, euphemistically known as a tank farm, so you don't think about the fact that it's storing volatile petroleum products, not something nice that is grown. That tank farm is a threat through the fire risk of this flammable diluted bitumen that goes through the pipe. So there's been a lot of action, civil disobedience and non-disobedient protest against the pipeline, as you all know. The First Nations of the Salish communities have been very active in this. This is the watch house on Burnaby Mountain that's built by the Tsleil-Waututh. And it's driven because of our immense concern for climate change. So this is most of Canada being shown here, covered by the plume of wildfire smoke in 2017. That was BC's worst fire season, and it was only followed the following year by the worst fire season, which was 2018 in terms of acreage burned. So we are all on the front line of climate change, and it's not getting any better. Even with the pandemic, where we expect a slowdown in greenhouse gas emissions, we have not seen a dramatic reduction. So everyone knows about this challenge. I think everyone also understands that it's no longer a technical or economic problem, it is a political problem. And that's where nonviolent civil disobedience has an important role to play. Yes, voting is critical. This is the pipeline route. The state of Washington also feels threatened by this pipeline and has vociferously opposed it. Met with varying degrees of cooperation by the BC government. I would characterize the NDP response to this as rhetorical. and very little action. And this, of course, drove me to my further action. So here I am in my camp for the summer, up in the treetops in Holmes Creek, which drains into the Burnett River, which drains into the Fraser. And this watershed is threatened by Trudeau's pipeline. They wanted to cut these trees down in order to make way for the pipeline. And we said no. And things have gotten a lot better for us in the last few weeks. We've moved out of the tent that you see in the left on this and up into the treehouse where life is pretty good. So my supposition is this, that well-planned climate action can lead to opportunities to improve health, equity, and human rights, and that civil disobedience is aimed at changing law or policies of the government where other actions have not been fruitful. It's an act of conscience, and participants accept possible punishment. This is very important because there is not a desire to defy the law. It's a willingness to break the law that our conscience tells us is unjust. And in that, we draw on the teachings of Martin Luther King and willingly accept the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over the injustice. And this is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And even the American Medical Association recognizes a physician's responsibility and their ethical duties sometimes exceed legal duties. And when a physician believes a law violates ethical values or is unjust, they should work to change the law. We certainly have done this. And in exceptional circumstances of unjust laws, ethical responsibilities should supersede legal duties. So it's a personal choice. Not everyone can do this. Different people in different times of their career have the ability to do this. I'm quite privileged at this point in my career to be able to do this. We all have gifts, and within these gifts are actionable items. And I have felt for some time now that this kind of action is really the ultimate in knowledge translation, putting yourself on the line. So these are the reasons why I have decided to take this action. There's no doubt that action on climate change is required. There's also little doubt that North American governments have largely stalled out in reducing greenhouse gases. They talk a lot about it, but very little action. Part of that, of course, has been the Trump administration, and we're very, very excited to have that reversed. But municipalities across the globe have declared climate emergencies, but the emissions are still not falling fast enough to meet the commitments that these countries made in 2015 in Paris. So this is compelling civil disobedience. So you may all know that it was ironically the day after Parliament declared a climate emergency in Canada that the government authorized the construction of the pipeline. And I would just point out that this approval process has been rigged, largely with disregard for Indigenous rights and the health risks, but primarily because the government took climate change off the table. So we submitted two important and large reports on the health effects of the pipeline, but we were forbidden in the process from mentioning the health effects of climate change, which were and continue to be the most significant impacts of the pipeline. So I got to the end of my rope. I just will finish here with a reference that I recommend to all of you that outline the criteria for civil disobedience, and happy to discuss this in the back and forth as to when these criteria are met. But our feeling is that with regards to Trudeau's Trans Mountain Pipeline, they have all been met. Important to establish coalitions. We need to work more in coalitions, and I'm very happy about the Rural Health Services Network because of the work in coalitions that is done. And this just outlines some of the partners that we've had in our work stopping Trudeau's pipeline. In the Lower Mainland, at least, we have seen very, very little action despite the construction schedule. So with that, I'll end and hope to engage further in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was really impressive. Like kudos for you for walking the talk, like for actually stepping up and doing it. I'd like to create an opportunity for a response to Tim, and maybe we should take a couple of minutes now to do that, and then we'll turn to Ilona in a minute. Would that be okay with you guys? It's a little breaks the pattern, but we've already broken the pattern in so many ways. Other panelists, would you anybody want to respond to Tim? Comments or thoughts?
Stefan, it's Alan. Just a very brief but an important comment. So Tim, I think you've earned the respect and the title of being a rational risk taker. This wasn't about gambling with your health so much as it was choosing to make a very profound and provocative public statement on an issue that deserves to be brought to the front. And so this is about stepping through the door of uncertainty in our personal and professional lives. And you correctly referenced this as civil disobedience. This is not being uncivil or provocative to the point that you're creating an illegal activity. This is about advocating in one of the domains that our professionalism requires us to advocate on, to be honest, which is not just thinking about individual health, but thinking about the health of a community, or in this case, that close connectedness to global health. So thank you for being a rational risk taker.
Thank you, Alan, for those wise words.
I think I would simply say Tim used lives two important additional things beyond the walking the talk. And one of those is humility. And one of those is an acknowledgement of privilege and what that means. And I think everybody on this call is probably privileged in some substantial way. And I think it's useful to reflect Tim's humility for all of us as we move forward, that there is privilege, there is luck. And when you add those together, they equal responsibility. And that is where I think we, particularly as physicians and people with significant power, need to keep our focus. So thank you, Tim, for reminding us of that.
Thanks, Bob. Any other comments? Or, okay. Ilona, do you want to take the stage for a minute and just tell us about the wisdom you have from Kimberly? And I have a lot of respect for your wisdom and what you're doing. Love to hear from you.
Sure. Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, I don't so much have a presentation as just I think you sort of asked me to present a bit of a community perspective. And so as a rural family physician, I guess, I noticed as we were going through all the wonderful presentations, there are a few things that I thought, that hadn't really, things that seem from my perspective to be quite important that we haven't really touched on. And so I guess those are the things that I wanted to just raise, just to throw into the conversation. I guess my bias is, one, I'm a rural physician, but I also have an interest in sort of community-based health promotion and disease prevention. And so, applying that to the climate change lens, I'm still really passionate about mitigation. And I feel like a lot of the emphasis is on adaptation. Of course, we have to do both, but I really think that if we do good mitigation, one, we might slow this down a little bit. Hopefully, I'm still, again, being optimistic about that. But I also think good mitigation policies can sort of roll over into great adaptation. And I try to envision, if I were a policymaker 50 years from now, when we're actually being forced to adapt, I think if we use that mindset and do those things now instead of waiting 50 years when we're being forced to, to me, it just sort of makes sense that we should be making those decisions with that mindset of, what would we do if we didn't have the fossil fuels or whatever it was. So that's I guess why I'm still quite passionate about the mitigation part. And for me, that seems like an important emphasis. The other thing, again, just from my observation, because I live in the clinical world and sort of within the health system, I also live in a rural community. I see a lot of great things happening, sort of in my own community and others, when it comes to mitigation or plans for adaptation. Maybe more so, I hear stories from urban areas, and so I do think there's a discrepancy or disparity that, because of resources or population or public pressure or whatever it is, I think there are still a lot of opportunities for rural communities to follow the lead of some of the more urban areas in some of the things that are happening. Of course, there's lots of progress, and that's encouraging, but still lots and lots of opportunities left. I think within my community, for example, I see a lot of things happening at the municipal level. The UBCM, provides, I think, extra incentive funding for communities to create plans and adaptation and mitigation plans for communities. There's incentives to do that, but I feel like the health community is often not part of those discussions very directly, and I feel like there might be something we can learn from the route that the municipalities are taking. I feel like they're a little bit ahead of us. And it's ironic because this is, as we know, this is a health concern. And it's curious to me. And again, I'm a family doctor. I'm not a politician or a policymaker. I don't know why this is, but we seem to be lagging a little. And I feel like because obviously healthcare facilities are part of the problem, we generate a lot of greenhouse gases, generate a lot of waste. It's interesting that we're not doing more. And so I guess what I would like to see is I would like to see the healthcare system, the health authorities, at every level, hospitals doing more. I think we get, as healthcare professionals, we're very focused, unless you're a public health physician, we're very focused on the individual sitting in front of us. And I think that maybe translates into our mindset, quite short-term and very small, whereas this issue obviously is long-term and very big. Taking Warren's example, I really liked his example of, treating this as if we were a doctor with making the diagnosis. I think we've got the history, we've got the physical, we've got we've done the investigations, and we have the diagnosis, but and then there's a disconnect. I mean, as a physician, I would never stop treating. I would never get to the diagnosis and then say, well, but now we're not going to treat. Our policymakers have set targets. They know what we need to do, but the treatment isn't happening. And so I guess I'm curious to know why. I'd love to know from people who understand policy and policymakers better than I do about how to do that. There've been a lot of great suggestions, and I'll let maybe all the others talk about a lot of the great suggestions that have come up from the other presentations. But I'm really curious to hear what the suggestions are about how to jump that gap from, we've got the diagnosis, we have a very sick patient, what do we do now? How do we convince the doctor to actually you know, perform the treatment or offer the treatment? Yeah.
Right.
What?
I'll take that on if.
Sure, Courtney.
So
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
think
Courtney.
we've been unconsciously, is that okay, Stefan?
Yeah, please, that's great. Yeah.
I think we've been unconsciously working with a information deficit framework. If you look at the number of commentaries we've written over the last decade saying we need to do something on climate, and actually we collaborated on one in 2012 or 2013. So, you know, just our relationship with regards to editorial, commentaries goes back at least 6 or 7 years. When I look at the advocacy curricula that we have as part of CanMeds, it tends to be the one that gets undertaught. It tends to be framed only as work done at the individual level. And what that does is it leaves people with a huge courage barrier in terms of working on these topics. I remember the very first day actually I met Margot. Margot, I don't know if you remember this, but I had just watched a wonderful panel presentation that she gave at the Canadian Public Health Association meeting, and Trevor Hancock was on the panel. And I had just been so lonely in my work, and I was so excited to finally find some of my people, that I stood up and I asked the burning question that was actually in my heart, which was, how do we find the courage for this work? And I think that courage is built of building blocks. And some of those have to do with mentorship, and some of them have to do with competency. And competency, we can really work much more on those. So when I look at what I actually need to be doing on a day-to-day basis to get work done, selecting targets for action, conducting a policy framework analysis, knowing how to analyze data, knowing how to tell stories, knowing how to write an op-ed, knowing who to go to revise my work, having relationships with media, understanding the political framework, to be able to incorporate yesterday's budget speech with the Lancet Countdown launch tomorrow. These are teachable skills, and we're not teaching them. And we're not funding the work, not because I have a ton of privilege, so I've been able to do this, but I've been working at this at about 80% of an FTE for free for 8 years. And that's just to try to get stuff done. We're not going to achieve scale unless we fund this work. And so it's a matter of where we place our values and what we teach people. If we keep being in the wilderness, saying problems and commentaries, we're going to lose, and there's absolutely no reason for us to lose.
Well, thank you, Courtney.
Stefan, it's Alan. I wonder if I could jump in on the back of Courtney there.
Sure.
And I'll probably frame it this way, and the reason I've chosen to follow Courtney. So Courtney has a connectedness to the community that I live and work in. Her grandpa was a patient of mine. And Courtney and I connected years later through the Canadian Medical Association, when I saw Courtney being very, very brave and taking the podium and the microphone and requiring the Canadian Medical Association to consider divesting from fossil fuels. So that's where Courtney and I have become connected, and we've become good friends through the dialogues and the discussions. But I want to just bring an Okanagan story to this venue. So, on August the 16th, 2003, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a wildfire was started by a lightning strike just south of Kelowna, just south of the city of Kelowna, across the lake from the rural community of Peachland. And it sparked what would become, at the time, the largest post-war mass evacuation Canada had seen to that point. We ended up burning about 64,000 acres of forest and fuel. Over 30,000 people were evacuated, and about 240 buildings were destroyed. Early that afternoon, I'd walked out of my home, and as I looked north up the valley, and this fire was burning 100 kilometers away, there was a pyrocumulus mushroom cloud that formed over the Okanagan Mountain Provincial Park. And it was absolutely visible from our home. It was a blue sky day, and yet here was this cloud that was being formed out of a natural disaster. It appeared very apocalyptic and very warlike. And as a professional, I just found it totally unnerving and unsettling to say, I have no skills to cope with this. I don't know what I'm seeing, and I don't know how this translates. And as Courtney has suggested, you know, we need to make it our business to understand how we can translate what's happening around us and reflect it on the public so we can draw allies as we champion advocating on climate change and seeking out effective policy changes. I've found particularly interesting and very inspiring, actually, the last 2 days, and I thought I would just quickly reflect a couple of the opportunities that I think I heard, and I'm hoping others have paid note to as well. The first is we have so much to learn from Indigenous laws, the laws of nature. And yes, you know, nature is sending us clues, just like the fire back in 2003, and there's almost repeated annual events now where, you know, we have fires burning in BC, our neighbors to the south on the west coast, and certainly even Alberta, and it does have an impact on our rural communities, our rural way of life, and in fact, all of the citizens, not just of our province, but these natural disasters, whether they're typhoons or hurricanes or fires, are impacting the lives of many, many people. So we're hearing about mass migration. I heard, you know, yesterday the issue of biodiversity and cultural diversity go hand in hand. I heard about amplifying youth and community voices. I also heard, if I heard correctly yesterday, that schools, the concept of schools as being an incubator for meaningful change. In other words, we can never start too early in inspiring and requiring people to understand what is happening around us and translate it into fundamental understanding. The piece that really resonated, though, was this whole notion of upstream as actually being a place, not some mythological figment of someone's imagination, but really, you know, that what happens in the downstream watershed, you know, where metro and urban is gathered, has a direct relationship and impact on those upstream neighbors, their rural communities. And we need to think about that. You know, the idea of stimulus investments with a rural equity focus, not just looking at our healthcare policy and other policies of government through a rural lens to say, well, we consulted at stakeholders or we had stakeholder engagement. What about if all of our policies required that rural communities, rural voices, that perspective was fully considered before a policy was implemented? And then, you know, the last piece for me, I think that stood out is that the well-being and health are so interconnected, both our public well-being, but also our individual health. And so I don't leave this symposium after 2 days feeling disillusioned. I think what I've heard is we can co-create through meaningful partnership a very, very healthy future. And we should certainly require ourselves as people of influence, because I think that's what we can do through the symposium as we move forward, is we can help change the conversation. So to people like Courtney that are making a meaningful difference, and you know, Courtney, you've been at this for a while. Some of us are newer to the conversation than others. I live in a rural community. I drive an electric car now. I have 30 solar panels on the roof of my house. I recycle. I'm cutting down on the consumption of plastics. I'm trying to make a difference through my actions, but I think I can leverage through this network of connectedness, and we can do way much more together.
Thank you,
Stephen,
Alan. Go ahead.
Oops, sorry. That was
No,
a
Margot
speaking moment.
Flower. Go ahead, Margot.
How are we doing? If I in the fireside chat, I'm wondering if I might be so bold, because I really like the idea of fireside chats, and I'm going to just, if it's okay, change the furniture a little bit and share my screen. So we're all comfortably sitting around the fireside here, and I'm just going to share a couple of images that in my reflections on what's been a really compelling couple of days, and it's been very timely for me in terms of some other work I've been doing to be sharing and exchanging with you. So my name is Margot Parks. I'm actually really pleased to be, it's actually very coherent for me as somebody who has been living in Canada for the last 15 years or so, to be back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for family reasons, similar to Pivy probably, but also connected with this global challenge we have. And there's something actually that is quite reassuring about connecting ourselves around the planet for these tasks. I find this image really helpful, and this image of ego and eco, I find it an extremely helpful thing for health professionals to think about. And given that we have been talking about both climate change and ecosystem disruption, and that has been something that's come through really strongly, is how we understand our home, and we stop thinking about the environment as a source of hazards, but as a source of our home. And climate change is just an overlay to everything that is also we're struggling with on those landscapes and on the living systems that we depend on. And so particularly for our health professional colleagues, it is a practice, and Alona, thanks so much for just bringing those questions about how as a practitioner we can move this forward, how we can be in that practice where we are not standing at the top, directing from on top, but part of the conversation, consistent with what you're just bringing forward, Alan. And Courtney, just the ways in which we can do this together. I've got a little bit, given that the whole and holism came through, my colleague Craig Stevens challenged me to write a chapter in a book, which is a lovely book down the bottom there, Animal Society and Health, Health Promotion, Harm Reduction and Health Equity in a One Health World. And one of the reasons to show this image is that it so compellingly reminds us of all our relations, and that we are not just talking about people and communities, but we are talking about the other, the finned ones, the legged ones, the winged ones that we are sharing this planet with, and we share that responsibility for. And so Craig challenged me to write about this idea of a specialized generalist. And we were talking, and so many of those things have come through in this last couple of days, particularly in terms of this idea of that we're working in cycles. Many of us have been at this at decades, but we're coming around again, and we need to, that courage and tenacity that we need to keep drawing upon for those cycles of work, for the building on existing strengths, for the fact that there won't be one approach to this. Tim knows how much I respect and am so relieved that he's been doing that important work, but the kind of advocacy Tim has been doing isn't for everybody. There's multiple pathways that we can find the courage to do this work. I think for health professionals, as somebody who trained as a doctor, but has worked outside of that space for many years, this notion, if we're a generalist, we have to know when to refer. And this is one of those times. We are not going to do this ourselves. And we need to build up the best reference circle we possibly can, just as we need to know for those individuals, we need to know how to collaborate in new ways. And I think that that's something that I would push us on. We know that health professionals want to do something, but in the spirit of the good questions, this is this last, this little section of questions. So these are some of the questions that emerged from me, which is from our time together. How can we develop health practices that are oriented to both living systems and equity at the same time, to get over that absurd false dichotomy that we're either talking about social systems or ecosystems? And there are practices that can do that, particularly in the spirit of those allies you mentioned, Alan, and that many of us have talked about. How can we contribute to health? How can health contribute to ongoing ecosystem and climate change conversations in a way that are humble and respectful and added value? We know that when health enters a conversation, it can completely derail community conversations, because suddenly all people are interested in a health service provision and the fact that they can't have a baby in their community. That's incredibly important. There's nothing about that that's not important. But sometimes if we are leading the conversations as health people, we will derail the conversation from the hard work that people are slogging away at, that we have to work in. So that third question, how can the health community be a valued partner to ecosystem-oriented processes, to land use planning, to watershed governance, to land-based education, not having to be, this is a health process, but other processes. And in the spirit of doing, and I know many of you are oriented to this, but how can we foster the value, the recognition and respect, and the funds for important actions like listening, convening and supporting. And those are some of the actions that we need at this time. We don't always need the hero to come in and solve this problem. And Courtney and I have laughed about this many times, that emergency physicians love to do things. And I am so glad that Courtney is doing what she's doing. But sometimes we don't need to come in with the solution. We just need to listen. And we need to bear witness to the hard work that is completely undervalued and that health can derail if it's not respectful and kind. So those are the kinds of conversations that I think we're interested in. I put this up yesterday. There are so many places where we can build these communities, and where we can do that where health is part of the mix and not at the front. So thanks for letting me sit around the fire. The bottom image here of the humble two-eyed seeing, where we sit around the fireplace and tell these stories, is always very moving to me, and I appreciate the chance to just do that, some of that from over here. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I just want to say, when I love it when years-long running conversations end up on panels, it's the best. And yes, I agree. And I think increasingly I've realized, and I said this recently when we were together, that the unconscious mental health impact of the diagnosis of climate change, I believe, are one of the things that we don't have insight into, that are in fact limiting our work. And I think one of the best ways for us to develop insight and remove that roadblock is to do some of the really deep discussion and connection and exploration that Margot was talking about. I didn't understand at first why I, as a, at that time, young doc, went to the CMA and presented all sorts of Lancet branded information, why people didn't take action. And I now understand that there were ecological grief, eco-anxiety, ecological guilt related reasons why they weren't ready to accept that diagnosis at that point. And so that has led me to a lot of work on those emotions. And I do think that both action and reflection are key.
Okay. Bob.
Maybe I'd ask the 33 of us to look at ourselves as a group and look what we've accomplished collectively in the last 2 days. And the elements of that have been really well outlined by the folks who have already spoken, and it would be spurious of me to repeat any of them. But just to contextualize that, a couple of things that I'd add to the conversation is that what we need is emergent behavior. In complex systems theory, the idea is that we become more than the sum of our parts. And that occurs all the way from the hockey team in the rink because of the dominant male concern about that we heard, which is a wonderful anecdote in terms of understanding how a community works, all the way to national policy. And we know that there are almost immiscible layers between the rhetoric and the action, and then between the legislation at the various levels, the policy, and then what plays out on the ground. I was a country doc for 2 decades before I moved to the university. When I moved to the university, it was the time when the Brundtland report had come out. My first major research project was related to sustainability, and it became very evident to me very quickly that where the action was is exactly what had been alluded to by some of the earlier speakers, the municipal level. And so I think we, you know, and if we see a thread of some of the thoughts that were there, most of the action and influence that folks of the 33 of us can do might be best focused there. Why do I say that? I say that because the path forward from today of how we can influence, if we look at the history of that path, we see a lot of blame. We see a lot of excuses. And that's our natural way of turning. Why? Because we made a fundamentally unfortunate term in the 19th century. And that's not just about industrialization, and it's about accepting a Darwinian view that the reason human beings are at the top of that false pyramid that Margot showed is because of our brain, and it's because of rugged individual, because of competition, and not because of collaboration. And we have heard the word collaboration, and that is absolutely key. Becoming more than the sum of our parts, whether it's on Burnaby Mountain, whether it's on Parliament Hill. How do we in fact do that? And I think we had nice demonstrations of that in terms of the courage and the humility to move forward. And one of the things that I think, and I don't want, my head is full of so many wonderful ideas that you collectively have gained, that I try and bring them together. So I thought I'd just step back and say, how are we going to do this? Well, in that group of people, whatever scale it is that we're looking at, we need three kinds of people, and we've seen them demonstrated among the 33 of us. We need dreamers, we need doers, and we need critics. And we need to be in dynamic tension. And at various times, some of us, all of us, will have to play one of those roles in terms of moving it forward, because that's a collaborative, not a competitive process in building that forward. So if it's about collaboration, if it's about cooperation, then maybe we should look at, why is it that we are continually pointing fingers at somebody else as being the failure? And one of the things that I've discovered over the years working in low resource and high resource countries is, if you get the pentagram partners together in the room at the same time, by the pentagram partners, this is just about health, but it applies to others. If you get the policymakers, the managers of whatever it is, the environment or the health system or whatever, if you get the professionals that are engaged in actually getting that work done, if you get the academy that tries to and presumes to study that, but most importantly, that you get the patient, you get the community engaged. If you get them in the room together at the same time, things get done. If you have only 4 of them, if you leave the policymakers out, then you get always, there's a lack of political will. That's why we can't succeed. If you leave the health managers out, you say, well, it's all the red tape, it's all the bureaucracy. That's the problem. If you leave the professionals out, you say, well, it's just the greedy professionals. They don't commit. You see what I'm meaning? When you get in the room together, you're human beings. When you get in a room together, you make eye contact and you recognize that we are all in this together. And we have a golden opportunity because of COVID, which has given us a sense, number one, that collectively we can do things, and number two, that we can do them together, not competitively, but together. And so, George's idea of generalism at the policy level, at the provincial level, sifts down to those areas where we can have a real impact. And one of the things that it takes, and I think this is something we really need to think about as we get our act together and really push for these recovery dollars, is that we need to be able to support functions like Laura outlined so well. We need to be able to, in fact, repurpose our funding to people of community action. We need to recognize the specificity of them. And part of that, and I just want to close with saying, is why is Comox Valley Comox Valley? Why is the Fort Nelson, the school district that way? And Robert Putnam, who was alluded to by, looked at that. It's because of the incredibly rich cross connections, because of the natural collaborations that exist in those communities. And I think if I had the privilege of studying the obstetrical services in the Comox Valley, and why they had been gone from being the worst and most conflictual area between family docs, obstetricians, and midwives to being an example of the very best in the province. And that was because the receptor site was there, but also because there was a funded position to build those. And of course, this is where I wear my expertise behind my belt buckle. There was food involved, and people sat down and they ate together. And that helped to make it work. So I'm sorry I babbled on, but I think if we can come out of this, as I think we already have, as more than the sum of our parts, not just forging old relationships and refreshing them, but forging new relationship, coming with the kind of respect that I've heard talked about here, and the kind of understanding and the resources that have flown through the slides and the presentations. And I think our job, Arlen and Stefan, is the one that you've already made strides on, not just little steps. By organizing this, by who you invited, how you organized it, you've helped us become more than the sum of our parts. And I hope that in the future that we will see ourselves fulfilling that journey together.
Thank you, Bob, for a number of kind things you've said, and also some important ones. And I want to make sure that Liz, you have a chance to get into the conversation, and George, who I know is always a little reticent about voicing his thoughts. So Liz, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll flip it over to George.
Actually, I'm happy to defer to George first.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the participants and my fellow panelists for great presentations here today. Mine will be a step down. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a real scientist, nor indeed something useful like a physician. But nevertheless, I may be able to add a dimension to the discussion today. I'll just note at the outset, I've almost compulsively been following American politics for the past 4 years. I just couldn't help myself, and I know lots of people were in the same boat. But what we've seen in America over the past 4 years is an absolute public policy wasteland, and probably worse than that under Donald Trump. So I've been interested in following what Joe Biden is going to provide as an alternative. So if any of you have the time or the interest, have a look at the public policy program that Biden has laid out. It's interesting in lots of ways, and I'm going to follow it with interest because well, first of all, he's titled his package of reforms Build Back Better, which, as you all probably know, is borrowed directly from the Sendai framework. And if Biden is at all true to the origins of that phrase, I think there may be some possibilities in what he is looking at. One finds, for example, in the Biden prescription, an explicit linkage between environmental policy and public health. And in some ways that I think we've been struggling to find the same linkage in our excellent discussion here today, Stefan, and thank you in the center so much for bringing this all together. So to me, I want to try to address the one element that you raised, Stefan, around enhance rural resiliency and strengthen rural health. And I guess as a recovering politician, but probably recovering too late. I spent 35 years in politics, so it has fundamentally affected the way I look at different issues and the way that I draw up my prescriptions as a political scientist. So I go to what I see as incremental possibilities
practical possibilities over the next year to achieve the ends that we have been talking about very persuasively over the past couple of days. So there's only a couple of things I want. They're simple things. They won't cost more than several $billion to the Treasury, so I'm sure they will be readily embraced. The first is an expansion and extension of team-based primary care into rural, remote, and Indigenous British Columbia. We do have some of that care in rural, remote, and Indigenous British Columbia today, but we need to extend it, and we need to deepen it. And in fairness, the province and Ellen and Bob are well familiar with this. There's a process going on with the Ministry of Health right now to try to do exactly that. And I think COVID-19 may be one of the ways that inadvertently we accelerate that process of moving team-based primary care into those further areas of British Columbia. What I'm calling for here is largely implies virtual care, but it in reality means a medical professional on one end of the line supporting a medical professional at the other end of the line who is likely accompanied by a patient looking for knowledge solutions, prescriptions that they can support. So what I want to do, what I want to see consistent with the Sendai framework is more resources being marshaled for disease prevention and remediation of health conditions. We had a wonderful webinar recently on type 2 diabetes and potential for remediation of that without pharmaceuticals, more based on dietary lifestyle choices. So that's the one thing I want is broadly in that area, more prevention, primary team-based primary care. Second thing, and this is the one that gets into a few $1 billion potentially. I think we could probably do a lot for $1 billion to $2 billion, but deployment of federal provincial stimulus dollars to accelerate fire and flood protection works in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across the province. So this is something that came out of the 2017 and 28 fire seasons. There's been lots of great work, and I'll just highlight a couple of them. The Skeechusin First Nation has done some marvelous work around ensuring that their territories are as safe from fire and flood as they can possibly be. It's a remarkable success story that the Skeechusin near Kamloops have undertaken. A second example is this small village of Logan Lake, again, done some amazing things on protecting their community from fire and flood. And Forest Enhancement Society brought it. So we know how to spend these dollars, but I think the federal and provincial governments need to be persuaded that this would be a remarkably important and successful way to utilize what are apt to be many billions of stimulus dollars directed over the next 12 months. So my assessment on the sort of where do we go from here, I think stimulus dollars will flow quite freely for the next 12 months or so. We may not have even seen the worst of the pandemic at this point, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the vaccine. But I think 2021 is still going to be hugely challenging around COVID, and we'll see governments moving stimulus dollars out. They're still borrowing at remarkably low interest rates to keep the economy going. In 2022, 2023, I think we'll start to see a curtailment of those stimulus dollars and a general tightening down of budgets, et cetera, as they try to move back to kind of normalcy. So the lessons from that, we need to form collaborative partnerships quickly. Now that's got to include the federal and provincial governments, they carry the bucks, but it's got to also include Indigenous communities and municipalities and other not-for-profit sectors in that collaborative partnership. We need leadership on this from respected groups like the Doctors of BC, I think you are uniquely positioned to take a well-articulated proposal to governments and say, this is the time when we need to be doing this. And thirdly, we need to find allies and advocates in government. We've been really fortunate today, Stefan, to have Rolly join us. I think he could be a remarkably powerful advocate among people in a government who I think generally are sympathetic to the objectives that have been articulated in our meetings these past couple of days. So those are my thoughts. I just think, you know, the time is right to move forward. And again, to me, I've described what my two modest proposals, I think, is incremental, but actually they're way more than incremental. They are, in a sense, revolutionary as well as incremental. So that's where I think I'd like to see us go in the days ahead.
Sorry, I can't help but say that if you want a dissection of ideology and what you're dealing with when we try to influence cabinets and so on, this is a pretty sterling read from George. So thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
We have to know the receptor site if we want to influence it.
Yeah, Tim, and then Liz if she wants.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to respond to George with a question with regards to the approach on this. I mean, I have really been focused a lot lately on the recovery package and what it really means and who's influencing it, particularly the British Columbia recovery package, because that's closest to home. But I'm just wondering if you could shed a little more light on that process, and in particular, the presence of health at the table or the absence, because the initial economic panel had no one from health on it. And in the context of what Margot says, which I do absolutely believe, that health is not likely to be leading this charge unless we are able to show the intersectorality in a real way that even policymakers who have been in their silo the entire career can see. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how this recovery plan could be shaped by the people on this call and others like us.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tim. That's a wonderful question. I probably won't do it justice with as wonderful an answer as I'd like to give, but I'll do my best. So I'll start with this observation. I concluded over my 35 years that I spent in public office that collaborative partnerships are always the route to meaningful programs, developments, and so on. That is, government never does it alone. Governments get excited when they are, as Bob would put it, presented with solutions rather than just questions, and especially if that solution draws in a series of partners that help to validate the content and direction of the program, it gets really exciting. And those are the best moments I enjoyed over many years. So second thing I'd say is government agendas are always full. That, in short, there are always way more demands for the resources government can provide than there is opportunities for them to embrace them and undertake them. So we need to get on the agenda. We need to convince government that these two elements around rural and remote community health and rural and remote environmental community health are really important things to undertake. And I think, again, that's where the credibility of an organization like the Doctors of BC coming in, because to be frank, government will be just a little bit surprised by environmental advocacy by an organization that's, you know, they work with as partners in health typically, not broader. So there's that. So on I guess the final thing, because I don't want to go on too long here, I do think that because the John Horgan government has just been elected, I mean, they've had their heads down dealing with pandemic through much of 2020. They've now won the majority government that they coveted. They have a very strong cabinet. They have 4 years ahead. I think it is just now that they will be turning their minds to where the hell do we go from here? Because just as we're talking about where do we go from here, you can bet in the cabinet room in Victoria, or maybe it's virtual still, I don't know, but they'll be talking about this. Where do we go from here? And they will be thinking about, so where do we most beneficially partner with the 10 billion or whatever dollars that the federal government's offering us? So they'll be thinking their way through, how do we make the best use? And so, I mean, I think it would be so timely to present government with a proposal that made as much sense as what we've been talking about here lately. And I think we can get on their agenda. I think we can, through people like Rowley, ensure that, you know, the folks in the important offices in Victoria hear the vision and hear the concrete proposals that accompany it. Did I answer your question though, Tim? I've been trained not to answer questions for 35 years, and often that instinct just takes over.
I think considering you know, the time we have and all, I'll get back to you. I think that identifying the opportunity as now, that's super important, because we do need to get on this if we're going to. But the tools and how to present the solutions that we have. So many of you probably have seen Senator Galvez's white paper on the recovery. There are a lot of very specific actionable aspects in there. But I'm not convinced that we can get to the table. These are, there's a lot of inconvenient truth in Senator Galvez's response for any government, but in particular a government that depends so heavily on the fossil industry. So it's that mechanics. We can get together on that sometime, hopefully.
Okay.
Can I just jump in? So I've had the good luck a couple of times at COP of being involved in the International Federation of Medical Students Association's advocacy efforts, and it's pretty cool. Liz has been involved with these. So you know, the world's smartest med students end up at the climate change negotiation. Everybody else is wandering around with no clue what they're doing, and they show up with like spreadsheets and a plan. And so what I'm hearing now is, if I'm trying to channel their approach, would be, we need a spreadsheet. We need to know what 3 to 10 goals we want to achieve. We need to know who we need to target and talk to in order to get those done. And we need people to sign up in order to do that. When I was doing the work for my platform development, I came across a really cool report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and they had audited the visits to federal decision makers by lobbyists for about 7 years. And fossil fuel companies were out lobbying NGOs and academics. I think it was 7 to 1. So when we think about the evidence that we have around pharmaceutical reps, and you know, the fact that a doc who has a meeting with a pharmaceutical rep, actually statistically significantly, it's easy to show that their prescription practices change, even if they don't think that they have. And then we sort of extrapolate that to what that type of influence will have on our decision makers. I think Bob's exactly right. We need to get in the room. And I think the more we can do it with a limited set of policy targets and people that we want to influence and coordinate, so that we're not kind of helter-skelter, because by the end of COP, we would end up with a spreadsheet that said, okay, Egypt, nobody is like, so-and-so is signed up to talk to the health minister from Egypt. It happened this day. This is what the outcome was. This is the outcome for Sudan. This is what the UK, yes, we have a plan. We're going to talk to, George will talk to the person, the health minister from the UK back in country. We've got that meeting set up. Like, that's what those spreadsheets look like. And I think it's a really effective way of mobilizing big groups.
I just want to build briefly on the importance of having insight into ourselves as well as into others that Courtney has called us to. I had the privilege of chairing a process of developing guidelines for the ethical relationship between, since it was reputed to be possible, between pharmaceutical companies and the medical profession, and spent 2 years in cross-country consultations. I never actually met the physician who had been influenced. I met their partners. And in one very memorable case in New Brunswick, I met his brother, but I never met him. And I've always taken that as a reality that we have to be very, very careful about our own ability to see our own outside influences. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Liz, do you want to get into the conversation?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Very inspiring couple of days and inspiring panel. And I would be remiss if I didn't recall exactly what Courtney was describing at COPS. And it was actually almost 5 years ago today. Facebook reminded me that I met Courtney in Paris at the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement, now almost 5 years ago. I actually specifically wanted to comment on some of George's suggestions with respect to Doctors of BC. I currently sit on the Environmental Health Committee, which is, a low-level committee, but is sort of charged with working on initiatives and policy related to, among other things, climate change. And my experience on the Environmental Health Committee has been a bit challenging. There is no climate change policy in Docs of BC currently. There's one that's been drafted that just now will hopefully go to the board, but questions about climate change are routinely met with, well, what about our members who don't believe in climate change? And I think that a lot of this conversation sort of takes for granted that the health profession as a whole, or that Doctors of BC is there, that the membership is there. And I know there are a couple of former presidents, Alan and Granger, here, who could perhaps speak to this a bit further. But I also wanted to actually call on Courtney again, because it sounds like she's had quite a bit of experience in sort of confronting some of the fears and concerns that may drive a position, drive a person or a physician to take that sort of position. And I think sort of secondarily sort of had a practical or maybe strategic question around, looking at some of the suggestions made by George, how those should be framed. Because, my experience, at least with Docs of BC, is that, framing, for example, expansion and extension of team-based care and primary care to rural and remote areas as an issue of, improving the access and quality of health services in those areas would actually probably be more persuasive in the Docs of BC context than actually connecting it to climate change, because it's a bit of a charged topic or issue. So I guess I'd leave those questions kind of there, not to be negative, but just to understand a little bit more clearly what a strategy might look like going forward, what our spreadsheet should really look, who should be on the spreadsheet, and how we sort of frame these advocacy efforts.
Stefan, it's Alan. Liz so well said, and I'm going to invoke the presence of Granger for maybe some commentary by referencing something that Bob has said so many times. So politics is the art of the possible, and that was Otto von Bismarck. And the qualifier is that it's also a noble pursuit. Granger, you were a conflict president, a conflict in a positive way. So why don't you help Liz with the questions she's asking?
Yeah, I was just considering that. Thank you for the opportunity. You know, this is such an important topic, and there will always be a diversity of opinion. But, you know, that's why we have elections, and that's why we have annual meetings, and that's why we have committees to feed up to the board who can then vote on it, etc. And I could recount many times when it's taken more than once to get a particular topic firstly at the right table, and secondly agreed and followed through with. Yes, there will always be people who say, no, that's not quite right. I don't think that matters. What we have here is a real coming together of opinion in this group, and I'm sure it's shared much more widely, that is so important and extends, I've thought for many years now, extends way beyond health. But it's a very important part of health. So yes, we should take this to the Doctors of the BC board. We should take it to the annual assemblies, etc., and we should push it. I will, if I may, just comment on one other thing. The theme that is coming through to me loud and clear is that of collaboration. And I think Doctors of BC and RCC particularly have championed this initiative for quite some time now with tremendous benefit. I would not for a second try to match Bob Willard's eloquence in outlining this, but that collaboration, that stitching together of everything from the activism that we heard about earlier, right through to the examples of collaboration. We need to bring it all together and accept that there are different parts of it to play, but our main objective is absolutely on collaboration. I am convinced of that. And that also should be part of what we take to Doctors of BC. Thanks for the opportunity.
Go ahead, Bob.
Stefan, sorry, I just wonder if I could bring to you something, you know, that's coming along in the chat box, and something, a very direct result maybe of the 33 of us together here. Back at the turn of the century, the dean tasked me, for various reasons, with leading a task force to transform the medical school curriculum from 34 hours a week of lectures to 4 hours a week of lectures, to small group learning and problem-based learning. And I said I would do it on two conditions, actually. One is that I wanted a student on every committee in the faculty. And two, that he had to recognize that this was not an academic exercise, it was a political exercise, and he needed to have my back. And we were very successful, largely because, as I learned, the students are by far the best agents of change, particularly in medical schools, but I've seen this work in other situations as well, because they have the most potent tool, and it's a tool, not a weapon, the most potent tool for change. And that I learned as a very young doctor in Clearwater. They have the question, why? Why are you doing it that way? And when you have to explain that, you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about what you don't know. So I was so inspired by yesterday morning students, and I hope to work with them to get these old but sometimes effective elbows to push doors open for students to be engaged in that. And I don't know what the mechanism is. I don't know what the magic is, but I sometimes think that grown-ups behave better in front of kids. And I hope that students don't feel that's a diminish, but I think we do behave better when we have the next generation observing and asking us why we're doing what we're doing.
Well, maybe I'll respond to you with a suggestion. And I think that there's a real richness of ideas and information that's been shared here, and collaboration is very much the order of the day. Maybe we should start with a working group, and maybe we should aim to have a working group meeting before Christmas, and at that time put forward a summary of the proceedings of this event, a summary of the ideas that were put in front of us, and have a discussion, take up the discussion in a different format where we're actually transitioning into some ongoing entity structure that will move the ideas forward. I want to just also conclude with another comment, and that's to do with timing. Timing is everything in life, in my experience. You know, and I went to a public health conference, and there was a workshop put on by one of the faculty there, and it was called "Let's Blow It Up and Start Again," and it was massively attended. Everybody went to that workshop, and including me, and it was a fascinating workshop because there was a huge freedom in kind of letting go of all of the entrenched, you know, constraints that exist around us. And you know, COVID is about as close as I've come in my lifetime to blowing it up and starting again. Like the world is a different place today. Things that haven't moved for decades have moved dramatically in a very short time. So I think timing is great to do something different, to really move forward. And you know, how that happens exactly is you know, is going to be complicated, but that's okay. But I think it's a great time to do that. Let me open that up then and see if there's any responses to that.
So it's a wonderful conversation. I keep to Bob's reference to the 31 people. I keep being very aware that there's several screens of people that could be part of this conversation. And knowing that most people here will be from rural communities, and asking this question about timing in the context of the COVID fatigue that I observe as I'm checking in with, I met with the co-chairs of the Nashaka Watershed Roundtable, who, of course, that's this morning, and we were talking about our upcoming planning process and the imminent land use planning processes that are going to probably be rolling out in the province that I mentioned yesterday, where decisions will be made in really important ways in partnership with regional districts and local municipalities around how we're going to be dealing with proactive issues like climate change. I wrote a comment in here about, as we think about the timing and we recognize that with this current government, we are likely to see several processes rolling out in communities at the same time. And my reference to the TSDTP process is not PTSD, but it does create PTSD because it's the same damn 10 people at every meeting. And when you've been going back to the same communities over 10 or 15 years, that's what you see, this incredible tenacity of people who are still willing to sit in complex conversations, despite the fact I have seen people crying in community meetings based on their experiences of the land use planning process in BC 15 years ago. And those are the same people that we will be calling on, and the next generation, that's why the students are so important, to how we can have new conversations that are not going to make people cry. And these are community leaders that are still turning up, but wanting to see better processes. So this collaborative spirit, which I completely applaud, has to be, I think, speaking of evidence and research, the attentiveness to how we begin these next rounds of processes in this recovery phase is going to be absolutely critical. And I would really strongly advocate to consider how the health community can couple with existing processes rather than creating a parallel process. And it's absolutely to the partnership pentagram type thinking. Bob and I wrestle over that over 15 years, over quite how much the partnership pentagram tends to entrap health professionals to only think about health partners. So if we can do, as Bob said, and recognize we're talking about managers in other sectors and in other community processes, we can really move forward. But if we just want to bring together the health partners and we're wanting to have a health conversation about building back better that's separate from the sustainability conversation, that's separate from the land use planning conversation, and that's separate from the disaster preparedness Sendai framework, that's what's happening in the Vanderhoofs and the Hazeltons and the Kitamats. That's exactly what's happening right now, and that's irresponsible. So in terms of timing, Stefan, this conversation is a very timely reminder that we have to be the best thoughtful, contextually informed community partners and not create parallel processes at this time. People are exhausted. And so we're going to have to do our best thinking, and we're going to have to be humble and listen before we start doing, so that we don't just, and don't be seen, I'm going to be as brutal as it sounds, don't be seen as the white savior complex coming in to save these communities at this time from the health professions. We don't need that right now. So how we can do that and at this time is going to be very critical. And I think land use planning conversations are a great place to have to bring the family docs. I think that existing disaster prevention, fire prevention conversations are a great place to be connecting with that partnership pentagram. Are we willing to do it? Are we willing to tell our funders that, no, this is not a health conversation, although health is absolutely critical here, but no, I'm sorry, we're not going to have diabetes prevention outcomes from this. We really have to be courageous and being willing to not make health the only conversation in these spaces. So that's my provocation to us. And we can do it. I'm really confident we can.
So Margot, thank you. That was really a useful perspective. And I think you should bring that to the working group. Like, I think that's really important. And I'd like you to come to the working group to talk about, because my perception as a rural family doctor and a rural kind of leader such as I've been, is that there is so much to do and so little getting done often over the years. We just go on. And unless we do it ourselves, it doesn't happen. And agree, there's lots of organizations with lots of perspectives. But when you get down to rural health at the community interface, it often doesn't happen. We just talk about it and then it just disappears. So my sense is, we do not want to duplicate anything. We do not want to, we don't want to waste resources doing similar things, but we want to get things done. And I think that's fundamental, because at the top of the watershed are the rural communities and the education and the Aboriginal Indigenous people, and that's the things that you're working on are so important, and do that, to work with. So let's have a working group meeting and see where we go from there. I really think it's valuable what you brought. Other comments or thoughts?
I'll just add one here. Bob was kind enough to hold up my book earlier. I think I owe him several drinks now but I wanted to hold this one up, and I've mentioned it in the chat box. You can pick it up there, but it's addressing the new normal 21st century disaster management in British Columbia. So I recommend it, not because I co-authored it, but I recommend it as one of the tools that you look at in terms of the kind of where do we go from here question. And I say that because, first of all, the report was requested by Premier Horgan. He asked me and Chief Maureen Chapman to co-chair the process. It was 5 months of meetings with Indigenous communities, with municipalities, with experts, and so on. So I think what we find in this document are two of the things that we've emphasized in our discussions. One is respect for Indigenous knowledge and respect for local knowledge in dealing with symptoms of climate change. So I think also powerful because it builds on, and I think this is one of the really good things that's in the report, it builds on several stories from the 2017 fire and flood season. So you can read about the Skeeches and what they're doing. You can read about the Akam First Nation down in the Kootenays and their remarkable partnership with the city of Cranbrook and with the, I think it's the East Kootenay Regional District, to do some really remarkable prevention work on a community that was remarkably vulnerable. And in fact, they were affected by the fires of 2017. So it's a bit of a, I think, a roadmap for where we go from here. And best of all, it has virtually all of the 100 plus recommendations have been endorsed by government. That's where they're going. They just need to be convinced that now's the time to make the investment to get there more quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, George. It's 2:30. It's time to wrap this up. This remarkably rich event. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing your wisdom. It's just been a fascinating discussion. I want to acknowledge the Rural Coordination Center and the Joint Standing Committee of British Columbia, which have funded and partially supported this event through the Rural Health Services Research Network. I really appreciate that. I'm going to have them covering my back, so to speak. And thank you, Alan. And yeah, we'll you know, I think that let's let this settle, and let's, you know, put some ideas forward to a working group. It can be a one-off meeting if everybody thinks that that was we should just let it rest, or we can turn it into whatever makes sense. I do know that you know, all 30 of us or 33 of us will be on this file for a long time. It's not going away. We're not going to be able to mark a checkbox anywhere soon. So any closing comments? Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, certainly. Just a quick thought, and you know, thank you for acknowledging the RCC and the Joint Standing Committee. This partnership is way bigger than that. This is a partnership of the collective we, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity. One of the things to think about as an action from this symposium then is the possibility of an open letter to face the public and to face society in our province. There's print media out there, there's online resources, and I think the media are hungry for stories that look beyond, you know, Trump in the United States and look beyond COVID. This is a story that could invigorate and create some very grassroots conversations. So maybe that's something to think about as well, is an open letter to the public and the citizens and the peoples of this province.
Just a quick follow-up to that. The Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health report is launching tomorrow. So I got an embargoed copy. There is a lot around a healthy recovery. There is quite a bit around housing, which I think can really align well with some of the housing related actions we need to take with regards to COVID. There's quite a lot around air pollution. So it's got some new stats to give good arguments for saving lives with electric vehicles, with home retrofits, and for really co-managing the twin planetary health crises of COVID and climate at the same time, so that we save not only our elders, but give our kids a chance to thrive as well. And so I think if anybody's got some energy around this right now, take a look at that report, grab your ammo, attach it to your local project, your local target, and yeah, use that as a fulcrum, as Bob was saying.
Great, thanks, Courtney. Any other closing comments? I would like to thank Arlen, the team, Yvonne, Sela, and Diane. Just extraordinarily wonderful support. Really, really appreciate it. Just great job. Anything else before we shut her down? Great. Thank you all.
We'd be remiss in not thanking you, Stefan, for stepping out of your comfort zone and sticking with this like a dog with a bone.
A dog with a bone. I'll take that one. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Okay. We'll see you later.
Thanks. Thanks, Arlen and Stefan. Nice to see everybody. Indeed.